Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse channel. And we continue our series on the book of Esdras and whether it was viewed as a standalone canonical book in the North African councils. If you didn't see the first two parts, I highly recommend to watch them first. And afterwards you can watch this one because this is a very confusing topic, very I would say also a long one, because we dive into a lot of details which is mostly missed especially in the apologetics, but also in some scholarly works, I believe. But we should first recap at least a little bit the first two parts, so it will be better for you to understand this part as well. This is the last part that is dealing with this alleged possible contradiction between North African councils and later councils like the Council of Florence and Trent. But I'm going to do another part which will deal with the Jewish reception of the book of Esdras. And I think it will be very interesting, so make sure to watch that as well. So, let's recap briefly what has been taught so far. So we saw that the North African councils are regarded in general as the first ones to address the canon. Some scholars would also say that it was probably the Council of Rome in 382, but some would reject that there is not enough evidence for that. Nevertheless, no one actually doubts that the North African Council did genuinely address the canon of the Bible. It certainly wasn't the Synod of Laodicea, because the 59th or 60th canon, depending on which manuscript are we talking about. This canon doesn't seem to be genuine. It seems to be a later addition to the decrees of Laodicea. When you compare it to the North African councils, these decrees were translated into Greek. They were received in the East. So actually they gained a kind of a universal acceptance. So even though these were not ecumenical councils, still they seem to be sort of a kind of a universal council, because they were received both in the East and the West. And these later additions to Laodicea, you don't find the canon list translated to Latin. And this is not just some kind of Latin bias. You don't find the last canon of Laodicea to be translated into Syriac as well, even though you have the other canons. So clearly that seems to be a later addition. But as I said, no one doubts that the decrees of the North African councils are genuine. And we also saw that the idea wasn't that the church had to establish some canon or pronounce, okay, let's say what the Bible will look like. No, that wasn't the intention. The intention was a kind of an exclusion approach. So there were many heretical groups that were accepting more books, and so the idea was to exclude these books, that nothing else should be read as divine scripture other than those books listed in the North African councils. And as Sweet and Bruce said, there were probably no other canon than the one that was basically received by the council fathers at the North African councils. And finally, Carthage 419 was adopted also by the Council of Trullo, which were made into the Second Council of Nicaea. And we also saw that there are no contradiction between these North African councils. Like Westcott thought that there's a confusion regarding the name of the Pope in Carthage 3 in the year 397. Actually, there's no error there. The first two the first two councils say that the decree should be consulted with the Transmarine Church, while Carthage 419 says explicitly that it should be consulted by the pontiff, and it gives the name Boniface, which is correct. So, just to recap, all these various books of Esdras. In the Hebrew Bible, you find Ezra and Nehemiah, while in large Greek codices, and many people would call these Septuagints, which of course we showed these are not Septuagints because you find their books from other translations as well, other than from the Septuagint. For example, Daniel, the book of Daniel is typically in the form of Theodotion, so this clearly proves that these are not true Septuagint codices, even though some people would label them as such. And in these codices, you usually find Esdras A, which is the Greek Esdras, which is the book we are addressing in these presentations, and you find Esdras B, which combines Ezra and Nehemiah. So this is the Greek translation of this combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah. In the Vulgate, you find Ezra on the heading First Esdras, Nehemiah is Second Esdras, Third Esdras is the Greek Esdras, and Fourth Esdras, also called the Apocalypse of Ezra. Actually, it's a composite work, and you can divide it to Fourth Ezra, which represents chapters 3 to 14. Fifth Ezra represents chapters 1st and 2nd, and 6th Ezra represents chapters 15 and 16. Now, if you're a Protestant and you have a KJV with the Apocrypha, then you will also, besides Ezra and Nehemiah, you will find in the Apocrypha section First Esdras, which is the Greek Esdras, and Second Esdras, which basically aligns with the Vulgate Fourth Esdras. So there are some differences between the Greek Esdras and the Greek translation of Ezra and Nehemiah. The Greek Esdras is a very harmonious text, consistent paraphrastic text written in very elegant Greek, and it tries to transmit you the message of the book and the story in comparison with the Greek translation of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is a very servile translation, a very literal translation, ad verbum translation. It's something like when you open an interlinear Bible, which tries to follow the word order and the particular words of the original language, so it would be Hebrew or Aramaic, and therefore it's very difficult to read. And basically the idea of such translation is not to use it in a in a everyday life or in liturgy, but to know what was the Hebrew original text. And the Greek Esdras was translated, mostly scholarly say it's in the 2nd century BC. Some would say it was in the 3rd. Nevertheless, the consensus is the 2nd century BC, while the Greek translation of Ezra and Nehemiah was translated sometime between 1st century BC and 2nd century AD, while the consensus is that it was translated as late as in the 2nd century AD. Both books were translated from a Semitic origin, language, Hebrew or Hebrew and Aramaic. So we also looked at some scholars, how they would basically argue that these two books are just different versions of the very same original, and so probably the Greek Esdras would be the original translation of the 70, so it would be part of the Septuagint, while the Greek translation of Ezra and Nehemiah would be part of the Kyrie recension. So what is the alleged issue with the books of Esdras related to our topic? So the North African Council says 2 books of Esdras. So the question is it the first Esdras, so Greek Esdras, and the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah, or is it something else? For example, Ezra as first Esdras and Nehemiah as second Esdras. So those who will propose that there is a contradiction between the North African councils and later councils, they would point to this basically labeling that the first Esdras was the Greek Esdras and second Esdras was the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And the reason why is because these are part of the large Greek codices, and they are frequently quoted by church fathers. In particular, the Greek Esdras was almost entirely preferred by the church fathers, and both these are part of the codices. On the other hand, the Council of Trent says that first Esdras is Ezra and second Esdras is Nehemiah. Therefore, Trent is excluding the Greek Esdras, and hence there's a contradiction. However, we looked at the so-called Syro-Hexapla, which is a Syriac translation of the 5th column of Origen's Hexapla, which was, the 5th column was the Septuagint. That was the collection of books which the church fathers knew as the Septuagint. Besides this translation, the person who translated it, called Paul of Tella, he also made some notes on the margin addressing the other translations, also Theodotion, Symmachus, and Aquila. But mainly, basically, his purpose was, in the Syro-Hexapla, to translate the 5th column of Origen's Hexapla. And in this Syro-Hexapla, we actually find that first Esdras matches basically the Greek Esdras, but second Esdras in the Septuagint was only Nehemiah and not the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So we clearly see that the Greek codices actually don't follow the Septuagint, but they use a different kind of numbering and labeling of the books of Esdras and Nehemiah. So therefore, this is probably how Origen's Hexapla looked like. You had first column in Hebrew, the second column was the transliteration of Hebrew into Greek, third column was Aquila, fourth column Symmachus, fifth column the Septuagint, and sixth column Theodotion. So based on the Syro-Hexapla, the first Esdras is the Greek Esdras, and second Esdras is Nehemiah. And that would be the very same thing. These two books would be just a different version or translation of the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah in Theodotion. What is also very interesting that in the Syro-Hexapla, there are colophons. Basically, these are some notes of the translator who give you some kind of information about the books. So both in the books of Esdras, the Paul of Tella is claiming to be translating the fifth column of Origen. So he's saying that these books come from the Septuagint. Same way, there's a colophon to the book of Daniel. And actually, in the Syro-Hexapla, we find Daniel in the Septuagintal version, which wasn't the most popular one. We really have just 3 or 4 sources for the Septuagint Daniel, because mostly the Theodotion was preferred. So just as the Septuagintal Daniel is just another version of the Theodosian Daniel, same way, first Esdras and second Esdras, so the Greek Esdras and Nehemiah, are just another version of the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And this is something which is acknowledged in scholarship. However, they make a little bit of error here, because they usually say that Greek Esdras is a different version of Ezra and Nehemiah, but that's not true, because the Greek Esdras is a version of Ezra only and not of Ezra and Nehemiah. And another thing, it would be a stretch to say that the Greek Esdras is a version of Ezra and Nehemiah, because in the Greek Esdras you have simply just 5% of verses of Nehemiah. Very, very little portion. Actually, is the smallest portion in the Greek Esdras. So it would be a huge stretch to call the Greek Esdras as a variant of Ezra and Nehemiah. It would be more appropriate to call it as a different version of Ezra Chronicles, because Second Chronicles is a much larger portion in the Greek Esdras than Nehemiah. So yeah, basically that's it. And we also saw that when we look at Greek manuscripts, there's a huge variety of labeling these books. So even when you look at the large codices, which would label first Esdras, the Greek Esdras, and second Esdras as Ezra and Nehemiah, many times you see an indication that there's a division between Ezra and Nehemiah, so these would be actually two different books. And I personally think that these Greek codices are simply different compilations, more expanded books. So I would say that books like 3rd and 4th Maccabees and some other books, but also New Testament books or post-Christian books like Shepherd, which you would find also in these codices, simply were not viewed as canonical. So what do I mean by that? I think that 3rd and 4th Maccabees weren't actually in the 5th column of Origen's Hexapla. Again, many scholars would claim that these are part of the Septuagint, but I don't think so, because at the end of the day, when you look at the church fathers, they don't quote third Maccabees at all. So I think books like 3rd, 4th Maccabees were actually added, into these huge codices due to some kind of value, but I don't think they were originally part of the Septuagint. Another indication would be the Old Latin. We don't find Old Latin translation of 3rd Maccabees or 4th Maccabees, but actually the Old Latin is a translation of the Greek Septuagint. So it's very interesting that you don't find it in the Old Latin, right? So that's another indication that these large codices are not simply Septuagints, but these are Greek Bibles, expanded Greek Bibles. But you have also other manuscripts in Greek which would label these books in other ways. So some would label as first Esdras the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah, or just Ezra, or second Esdras is sometimes just Nehemiah, or even Greek Esdras. And you will find also some later Greek manuscripts labeling Nehemiah as 3rd Esdras. Now, of course, you can point out that, okay, this is a later manuscript, but the point is that, it doesn't matter, because you don't see Nehemiah to be quoted as 3rd Esdras. So what I want to demonstrate, that there's a disconnection how you can find some books to be labeled in Greek Bibles, and how this doesn't really match the general recognition of labeling these books, So really can't follow the Greek Bibles to in order to figure out what was decided in the North African councils. When we look at other translations like the Syriac, in the Syriac probably the Greek Esdras wasn't there originally. That would be the Peshitta, but it was added later through the Syro-Hexapla. Same way the Textus Receptus of the Ethiopic text originally didn't include the Greek Esdras. So we see that this wasn't so universal, and some regions preferred Ezra and Nehemiah, and some preferred the Greek Esdras. And therefore, we cannot even say that the Septuagint was the translation of the ancient church. That is again a stretch. You had several other manuscripts and several other translations which were equally which were held on equal level as the Septuagint. When it comes to the Old Latin, which would be the most significant in regards to the North African councils, because the Old Latin was used in those parts of North Africa, and the problem is scholars acknowledge that there's again a huge variety between those among these Old Latin manuscripts. And another problem is that we don't really have one single Pandect or one single Bible in the Old Latin version. You have different books in the Old Latin scattered throughout in much later manuscripts, which are part of the Vulgate. So these would be in the 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, and so on, much later. So you have always a book or two included in the Vulgate in the Old Latin form. So therefore, we cannot really know, how an Old Latin Bible would look like actually in the first 4 or 5 centuries. And therefore, Gallagher and Mead, I think, rightly conclude that the titles of the books of Esdras in Greek and Latin are notoriously variable. There is no certain evidence how the various books of Esdras were distinguished before the 4th century codices. Another interesting thing was that when we looked at the quotations, and you saw that basically in the East, the quotations of Greek Esdras gradually and slowly decrease. Nevertheless, there is still some retention of this book in the East, and that would be natural due to the Septuagint. But in the Latin West, it's still used in the 5th century, naturally, because the last council in North Africa that addresses the canon was in 419 in the 5th century. But after that, in the 6th century, quotations dropped to 0. And basically, Greek Esdras is not quoted anymore. That's very interesting. And this aligns very well with the theory that basically the last North African Council, Carthage 419 at least, would actually canonize or pronounce the 2 books of Esdras as Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, many people would claim that it's due to the influence of the Vulgate, because in the Vulgate you don't find the Greek Esdras originally, and therefore people stopped quoting it. But first of all, in the 6th century, you still have the Old Latin manuscripts, which would be used. And the second thing is, you still would find, at least in some manuscripts, the Greek Esdras. And the third thing is that if the Greek Esdras was elevated to the level of canonical or inspired book, then we should expect it to be quoted further on in later centuries. So, but this is not what we see actually here on this chart. And why was the Greek Esdras so much quoted in the first 5 centuries? And as I said, the Greek Esdras was a better translation for ordinary use and for liturgical use. And on the other hand, the Greek translation of Ezra and Nehemiah actually was a more rigid translation following the word order of the Hebrew, ignoring Greek syntax or Greek grammar. So this would actually make it very difficult to use and read recreationally. Therefore, both Ernest and Timotheans, I think, reasonably conclude that the reason why the Greek Esdras is so much preferred in the Old Church is due to this very characteristic. Now, one can also argue that Greek Esdras has this advantage that it's part of the Septuagint, which would be some kind of a preferred version or translation. That might be a reasonable argument. Nevertheless, Daniel was read in Theodotion, so the Septuagint was so decisive. What was decisive is something else, and I think in this particular case, it's due to the linguistic features of these books. Now here you can see the chart from the previous presentations or videos, how the church fathers labeled the books of Esdras. And so first Esdras would be represented either by Ezra or the Greek Esdras, two variants of the same book. Second Esdras was Nehemiah, third Esdras was fourth Ezra, and probably fourth Esdras was the combination of 5th and 6th Ezra, but we cannot know for sure. But certainly, I think the first three are correct. So, as you can see, both Ezra and Greek Esdras would be first Esdras, the same book, just in different translations or different versions. So we also looked at the fact that it wasn't just the Septuagint that was used. Many church fathers quoted many other translations like Theodotion, Symmachus, and so on. And it's not only the East, but also in the West. So Augustine, without a problem, appealed to Jerome's translation. In fact, as Gallagher noted, Augustine does not think that the 70 translators accurately rendered the Hebrew original in every passage. And in the City of God, Augustine says that both the Hebrew and the Septuagint are basically inspired. So that's very interesting. On the other hand, Jerome acknowledges that the Jews tempered the original text or corrupted the sacred scriptures. And, these are things that mostly people don't know, that actually Jerome would say such thing, that the Hebrews corrupted something, right? Because he was following the Hebrew verite, that the Hebrew is the original. Nevertheless, in his letter to Augustine, says that the Jews corrupted the text. And that was the point of his translation, to show that. And on the other hand, such an ardent defender of the Septuagint like Augustine was, he would actually acknowledge that the Septuagint isn't correct in each and every case. And in the very same work, in the City of God, Augustine quotes a passage from Greek Esdras, which is the extra canonical passage, the story of the three bodyguards. And many people would say that here Augustine says that this is a prophecy about Christ. But actually, when we look at the text, that's not what Augustine is saying, but he says this is one possible way to read it, and probably some people would say that it's a prophecy. Nevertheless, Augustine himself says that this is just a historical book without prophecy in it. So, like Michael F. Bird would say, for Augustine, this certainly isn't a prophecy. So these are not just, my words. And this raises the question whether Augustine thought that this part of the Greek Esdras would be some kind of genuine part, or look, if you are gonna say that Augustine claimed that this is a prophecy, then why didn't he say so? I mean, he could have been much more clearer. But just the opposite is what we can see, that he says, unless perhaps this should be understood as a prophecy. So it's very ambiguous, and this is something very similar what Jerome says about the Shepherd of Hermas, that he says, if anyone wishes to accept its reading. But Jerome himself didn't think that Shepherd of Hermas is scripture, actually. But if you would read, only this from Jerome in isolation, you would think that Jerome would regard this book as inspired, but we know he didn't, because he actually didn't like this book. So this quotation from Augustine isn't really decisive. Now, I would argue he certainly thought that the Greek Esdras is canonical, but as a variant of Ezra, okay, not as a standalone book. And we looked also at the so-called canonical lists of the church fathers, and basically over and over again we see that the two books of Esdras, first Esdras and second Esdras, are the very same thing as the one book of Ezra among the Hebrews. And of course the Hebrews would accept only Ezra and Nehemiah. So this is another indication that for them, first Esdras was basically either Ezra or the Greek Esdras, two variants of the same book, and second Esdras was Nehemiah. Unlike many scholars would say that first Esdras was the Greek Esdras and second Esdras the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which doesn't really make sense at all in this context. So to summarize those first two presentations, manuscripts are not consistent when it comes to the naming convention. Quotations are not consistently from the Septuagint in general. Church fathers quoted other translations as well. And of course the Greek Esdras is preferred until the 5th century for a very good reason, because the Greek Esdras is a much better translation. But after the 5th century, in the Latin West, quotation rapidly dropped to zero, which is very, 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 very significant, I would say. And Jerome even didn't feel the need to translate the Greek Esdras, or, at least the part, the extra canonical part, which you would not find in any other books. But when it comes to Daniel, he translated or included in his Vulgate the book of, the story of Susanna and the other additional material, same way with Esther. And regarding Baruch, he at least explains why he's not going to translate this part of Jeremiah, because Baruch was actually part of Jeremiah. And finally, the lists consistently present the two books of Esdras as the single book of Ezra among the Hebrews, which would be Ezra and Nehemiah. So let's look at the period after the North African councils. So this is the premise. If Greek Esdras was regarded as a standalone canonical book in the North African councils, what we should expect is an ongoing usage of this book and quotations from this book. If really this book was regarded as a standalone canonical book on the level of canonical inspired scripture, then really church fathers should be quoting it even after the North African councils. It should be attested in many manuscripts, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if it wasn't regarded as a standalone canonical book, the opposite should be or will be true. So let's look at first at the manuscripts. Now, as I said in the previous presentation, one of these scholars I'm going to address significantly is Bogat, because he's the one who wrote probably the last article regarding this topic, and a very significant article. It's quoted really heavily in scholarly works and books. And this is what he says, that in the Vulgate, the division into two appears first, for the first time, in the primary hand of the Cologne manuscript from the end of the 8th century, and in 3 Spanish manuscripts dated from the 10th century. In the manuscript from Cologne, the explicit of Ezra and Nehemiah is Liber Esdras in the singular. Furthermore, subsequently, the division into 2 books was curiously omitted. Further, Bogat says, again, he basically repeats the very same thing about the Cologne manuscript, and this is also what he says. First, in Northumbria, around 700, scribes distinguished Nehemiah from Ezra. The individuals, not the books. So he says that in Northumbria, there is no division, probably, of Ezra and Nehemiah with their own headings and own titles, but there is just some kind of distinction between the authors of those texts. It says this approach is logical since the character of Nehemiah is undeniably prominent in the second part, and a subtitle, Words of Nehemiah, suggests the division. But this approach had no practical consequence, and the book remained singular. In other places, particularly in Spain, from the 10th century onwards, 2 books of Ezra are distinguished, which is somewhat unnatural, as Ezra is almost absent from the second book. However, this division gradually spread and became the usual practice in the Bible Parisiensia, and the common usage thereafter. To explain this, it is almost certainly necessary to appeal to a canonical motivation. Biblical lists usually mention 2 books of Ezra, as we have seen. So, several noteworthy remarks here. So first, Bogat says that basically the first some kind of indication of a division occurs in Northumbria around 700. That would be the Codex Emauas, by the way. But the compiler of Emauas is distinguishing only basically the author, but he's not distinguishing different books. So he says there's still just one book of Ezra, and there are texts of 2 authors, and the beginning of Nehemiah is signaled with words of Nehemiah. But this, this has no practical consequence. And just it is only from the 10th century in Spain when you see Ezra as first Ezra and Nehemiah as second Ezra. And he says that this division into 2 books occurred due to a canonical motivation, because people looked at how, how the church fathers labeled the books of Esdras, and because they say there are 2 books of Esdras, then, well, the church decided they're gonna divide this one book of Ezra into first Esdras as Ezra and Nehemiah as second Esdras. Well, let's look into the manuscripts. So first, I think the earliest problem in manuscript in Latin after the North African councils, to my best knowledge, is the Leon palimpsest. A palimpsest is basically a book or codex where, originally there was another text which was basically rewritten. So you can see 2 texts written over each other, something like that. Okay. Nevertheless, the Leon palimpsest retained only some of the books. Many of them are lost, and these ones on the right, these ones actually which you will find factually in the manuscript. And as you can see, the only book of Esdras which is there is 4th Esdras. So it's not even the canonical Ezra Nehemiah, or not even the Greek Esdras, but it's the Apocalypse of Ezra, which just signals that basically this is also some kind of expanded Bible, because no one thought in the North African councils that 4th Esdras is canonical. So we should be very careful with manuscripts and Bibles, because 4th Esdras clearly wasn't regarded canonical. Now, scholars would, however, argue that we can reconstruct the original palimpsest, and it would include also 1st and 2nd Ezra. The question is, which books are 1st and 2nd Ezra, right? Because this is a reconstruction. Those scholars would also claim that it did not include the book of Baruch. I cannot be sure about that, because this is a huge reconstruction. This is not something like when you look at the Codex Sinaiticus and you have really just a few folios missing in between some books, and therefore you can assume very clearly and reasonably that a particular book was present there. Okay, so I can acknowledge that the Greek Esdras was included in the Sinaiticus because we can reasonably reconstruct those missing folios. However, here are a bunch of books missing here, so I don't think you can, convincingly say that, Baruch is missing, or that your reconstruction is correct if so many books are missing here. But if we accept this, that Baruch was missing, then it's probably a Vulgate kind of manuscript, because Jerome omitted Baruch, so therefore 1st and 2nd Ezra would be Ezra and Nehemiah. So, and therefore the Greek Esdras is missing. Now this is the Cologne manuscript Bogat was talking about, and this is the beginning of Ezra. Okay, so incipit liber Esdras, so the beginning of the book of Ezra, and that's on folio 94. But when you look at folio 112, where is the beginning of Nehemiah, you can see that it mentions that this is the beginning of Nehemiah. Okay, the book of Nehemiah. So there's a clear division and distinction between the book of Ezra and book of Nehemiah, which would be different from Jerome's approach, who had only one book of Ezra, but probably he didn't make this distinction, I would argue, following the Hebrew original, right? And this is the end of Nehemiah, and at the end there's the colophon, and it says that this is the end of the book of Ezra. So under the heading or title Ezra, you can actually find two books. It would be the book of Ezra and book of Nehemiah. And Bogat said that in Northumbria they distinguished the text of Ezra and text of Nehemiah without any practical consequence, that the reason why they would include the heading words of Nehemiah is because in this second part you don't find Ezra as the prominent figure, but Nehemiah. But look at this, there's actually a distinct title for the book of Nehemiah. It's not just a distinction between the text, so this is the text of Nehemiah, or that the author of this part is Nehemiah, the words of Nehemiah, but actually it has a separate title. It's Nehemiah. Now it's true that even the book of Nehemiah runs under the heading of Ezra, as you can see here, but there's a clear distinction between those two books. Ezra has its own title and Nehemiah has its own title. And look, this is the end of the book of Nehemiah, and again it says that this is the end of Nehemiah, clearly. Although actually it says that this is the end of Ezra, Sive, Nehemiah. So the knowledge is that basically Nehemiah is a distinct book, I would argue. And that's the very same thing you find in other manuscripts from Metz, France, bibliotek, from the 8th and 9th century. And by the way, Emauas is the first complete Vulgate we have. So this would be very, very significant, I would say, because I didn't find any text of the Vulgate version of Ezra and Nehemiah prior to the Codex Emauas. So this one is from the 8th and 9th century. And again, this is the beginning of Ezra. It says this is the beginning of Ezra. But on folio 279, you find that Nehemiah is mentioned. And at the end of Nehemiah, again, the very same thing you would find in Emauas, that this is the end of the book of Ezra and the words of Nehemiah. Why did they make this distinction? I mean, I don't think they're just, pointing out that these are the words of Nehemiah. I mean, that would be clear, very clear from the text itself. You don't need to, make it even clearer. Especially, I mean, if you could find these combinations in some Greek manuscripts, when you compared to the Greek manuscripts, when you looked at Esdras B, here the distinction is much more explicit. Nehemiah has its own title with a huge break. Okay, this is another manuscript from Switzerland, from the 8th and 9th century. And unfortunately, you won't find Ezra in this manuscript, but only Nehemiah. And it begins with Verba Nehemiah Filii Helkie, so the beginning of the words of Nehemiah. Now remember what Bogat said, that it's not until the 10th century in Spain where you find Ezra labeled as first Esdras and Nehemiah as second Esdras. But actually we have Codex Censes, which is Spanish, right? So let me go back to Bogat. Where was it? Okay, so he says it's not until the 10th century in Spain that you have this clear distinction into two books. These manuscripts would be Legionensis, Complutensis, and Toletanus. But when you look at the Codex Censes, it's true you have one book of Ezra, and again the text of Nehemiah is signaled here, the words of Nehemiah. But look at here, there's a text in the margin, and it says Hic secundum liber incipit. Here begins the second book. Well, second book of what? Well, second book of Esdras. In the right, you can see that this is clearly a continuous text, right? With basically this small note here that these are the words of Nehemiah. But the margin is very clear. It says that this is the second book. So actually, already in Codex Censes, we see that there's clear labeling of Nehemiah as second Esdras. Now, one could argue that, okay, this might be later inscription, but if you look at the style of the text, it's actually very similar, if not identical, to the text itself. So I think this is originally part of the manuscript. And of course, here is one of those 10th century manuscripts, Codex Censes, which divide Ezra and Nehemiah into two books as First Esdras and Second Esdras. But an interesting thing what I found from Bogat in the New Cambridge History of the Bible, he says that actually Cavensis and Toletanus may go back to archetypes of the 7th century. So was actually this division into First Esdras and Second Esdras, was this division even an earlier division, which would go back to the 7th century? That would be contemporary with the Codex Emauas, right? And Houghton says the same, that the manuscript appears to be a copy of Appendix from the beginning of the 7th century. Okay, so that's the claim. So actually, I think that Ezra and Nehemiah's two different books of Esdras, this division was recognized much earlier, I would say, if we go just by the arguments made from the manuscripts. Now, but what about the Greek Esdras? Is Greek Esdras attested before the 10th century, let's say? Well, scarcely. Only in two manuscripts, Codex Colbertinensis and Saint Germanensis. These are the two only. So, as I said, if the Greek Esdras was reckoned as a standalone canonical book in the North African councils, why only two manuscripts? Why don't we see in Emauas, Cavensis, Toletanus, and the manuscript from Cologne and from other manuscripts? Why only these two? Now there's another manuscript of Vercelli from Italy, but that's from the 11th century, very late. And what is significant that in this manuscript you have the Greek Esdras labeled as First Esdras, and Second Esdras labeled as the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay. But what is even more significant that these two books are in the Old Latin form. So Bogat argues that this is some kind of evidence that even before the North African councils, First Esdras was basically Greek Esdras, and Second Esdras was the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah. But first thing, it's from the 11th century. I mean, sure, it's in the Old Latin, so it would be a copy of much older manuscripts. But the much bigger problem to me is that you have only one manuscript, using this name convention. So, I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to manuscripts. I mean, certainly in the ancient church there were plenty of Old Latin manuscripts, and this might be a copy just of one type, So I don't think you can make any firm conclusion based on the manuscript of Vercelli. That would be very, very far-fetched. You don't have this significant cohort of data where you can compare multiple manuscripts, and convincingly, conclude that this was the general labeling among the bishops and the church fathers in the Latin West. I really don't think so. Just as with the Greek manuscripts, you had various, labeling and naming conventions for the book of Esdras. And even in the Vulgate, Bonifacia Geshe argues that the naming of different books of Ezra is more complicated in the Latin Bibles. Up to the 13th century, Latin Vulgate Bibles contain normally only the translation of the Hebrew Ezra. That's one significant thing, what Bonifazia Geshe says, that normally you don't find anything besides Ezra and Nehemiah in the Vulgate manuscripts. And he says the translation of 3rd Ezra is only occasionally included in the Latin Vulgate Bibles at this time. But if 3rd Ezra is present in a codex, the numbering becomes even more confusing. It was counted either as first or as second or as third book of Ezra in different manuscripts. So if there was such freedom even in the Vulgate manuscripts, how can you be so sure that the Vercelli manuscript represents the consensus? I don't think you can safely, conclude that this was the fact, And actually, when you look at the articles from Bogat, he acknowledges this confusion here, that you can have various naming conventions even in the later Latin manuscripts. Okay, so here you have the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is what Bogat thinks you would find generally in the Septuagint and the Old Latin, which I would disagree that it's the Septuagint. It's just Greek Bibles. There's the Complutensian manuscript and other later manuscripts, and you can see that there are different kind of labelings of the books of Ezra. It's much more visible here in this other chart, table from Bogat from a later article. So under the heading first Ezras, you can find just Ezra or Ezra and Nehemiah or Ezra and Nehemiah and 3rd Ezras or part of it. And 2nd Ezras can be Nehemiah or 4th, 6th, 5th Ezra. 3rd Ezras can be 4th Ezra or 3rd Ezras. You see, this is problematic. You cannot really argue for manuscripts, I would say. What seems to be, however, consistent is that Ezra is followed by Nehemiah. So here Ezra is followed by Nehemiah, Ezra is followed by Nehemiah, Ezra is followed by Nehemiah. That's a consistent pattern we see. So Ezra is followed by Nehemiah, not the Greek Esdras is followed by Nehemiah. So these would be my questions I would ask from Bogat. Why do we see consistently Ezra and Nehemiah present, but not the Greek Esdras? And why is there an indication of division within the manuscripts? There's always, this division between Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah has its own title. And the second thing, or second question, many books from the Old Latin that were not translated by Jerome are present. Why not the Greek Esdras? Jerome translated the Proto-Canon, the Hebrew Bible, as well as Judith and Tobit, and also included the addenda to Daniel and Esther, and that's it. So why do we see these other books, Wisdom, Sirach, etc.? Because the church regarded these canonical. But if the argument is that the church also recognized Greek Esdras as a standalone canonical book, why didn't they, integrated the Greek Esdras as well? They could have, but they didn't. Third question, if the division into Ezra and Nehemiah, so into 1st Esdras and 2nd Esdras, was motivated in the 10th century in Spain by ancient lists, why not integrating Greek Esdras into the Vulgate, as I said? So it would be 1st Esdras and Ezra and Nehemiah would be second Esdras, just as in the large Greek codices. Instead, they are simply choosing to divide the one book of Ezra into Ezra and Nehemiah as first Esdras and second Esdras. Well, if it was recognized as the Greek Esdras as a standalone canonical book, why not integrating it into the Vulgate? Just as they did with Baruch, right? So Bogat has this article about the book of Baruch, how it's missing from some of the earliest Vulgate manuscripts, and he argues that it was later integrated because Baruch was actually viewed as a canonical book. Well, if Greek Esdras was viewed as a canonical book in the North African councils, why didn't they integrate it as well? Very simple. And the Greek Esdras would have this benefit or advantage that it was one text with its own heading and title, right? But the Baruch is much more complicated because it did not have its own heading or title. It was part of Jeremiah, there was no book of Baruch as we know today, but it was part of Jeremiah. And my fourth question would be, why is it unnatural to label Nehemiah second Esdras? If that was the case in the Syro-Hexapla, clearly this is not some kind of innovation. Second Esdras was actually Nehemiah, so I don't think it's unnatural. Now let's look at the Greek Esdras in the Church Fathers' usage after the 5th century. So in the East, as I said, there's still some retention of this book, naturally, I think, due to the Septuagint. Some you will still find some people quoting it here and there, but not in the West. The West, you won't find it to be quoted anymore. That's a huge, huge difference. When we look at the lists, in the East, you have John of Damascus, whose list is very similar to those before the 4th century, where he compares the Hebrew books to the Christian books. So he says, observe further that there are 22 books of the Old Testament, one for each letter of the Hebrew tongue. The first and second books of Kings are one book. The third and fourth books of Kings are one book. First and second books of Chronicles are one book. The first and second books of Ezra are one book. So just as first and second Chronicles or Kings are one, the same way first and second Ezra is one book among the Hebrews. So this is just confirming the same thing what previous church fathers said, that actually the first and second book of Ezra is the same thing as the one book of Ezra among the Hebrews. This leaves no room for such combination as Greek Esdras as first Esdras and Ezra Nehemiah second Esdras, but rather it would be the Greek Esdras / Ezra as first Esdras and Nehemiah second Ezra. Now in the Latin West, the earliest list would come from the Bobbio Missal, I think, to my best knowledge. And Missal is basically it's a book that is used in the liturgy. So in this manuscript, you will find a list of canonical books, and there is only one book of Ezra, which would be Ezra Nehemiah. Further, we have this 6th century work by Cassiodorus, who wrote the Institutions, and he gives us actually 3 lists. First according to Jerome, second according to Augustine, and third according to the Septuagint. In Jerome, you find naturally one book of Ezra, but in Augustine and the Septuagint, there are 2 books of Ezra. Moreover, Cassiodorus was familiar with Origen's expository sermons on the two books of Esdras. So Cassiodorus would be familiar with the old naming convention as well as the new naming convention, yet he makes no note, or he is not reporting any inconsistency between the two, actually. So he's not saying that in this translation there's an extra book, but in this newer translation this extra book is missing. Furthermore, notice that he mentions the Septuagint, but when you look at the list of the Septuagint, it doesn't include 3rd or 4th Maccabees, for example. So this is why I say this is just confirming that the Septuagint, the 5th column of the hexapla, actually doesn't match with the collection which you would find in those great, those large Greek manuscripts like Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, and so on. And why Cassiodorus, this church writer, is so significant, because he was the one to make a first comparative text of the Latin Bible. So he would be something like Origen in the East, comparing these different translations. And this is actually textual criticism, right? So Origen would be the first one to do textual criticism of the Old Testament, and Cassiodorus did something similar in the Latin Bible, actually. And so, as Denter says, since he had all these translations, he would have noticed the difference, right? But Cassiodorus actually says nothing. He's mute. He's not reporting any incoherence between those translations. And the reason why is, I would say, because the first and second Esdras of the Old Latin would be the very same thing as you find in Jerome's Ezra. That is why I would say that's the explanation. So Cassiodorus is very significant, even though he's not citing the books of Esdras. He just gives these lists, but we know he was a scholar basically in the Old Latin and the Vulgate, and he stands on the turning point, as Denter says, where both translations are used, and the Vulgate is slowly superseding the old translation. Another significant church father would be Saint Isidore of Seville. He was, I would say, also a scholar of the Bible. He wrote many things on the Bible, actually, and he gives us several lists. And you can see here the first one. It's in Libros Veteris ac Novi Testamenti Proemia, and it's a Christian list, actually. He includes the Deuterocanon, and notice this, he mentions only one book of Esdras, only one. But when it comes to Maccabees, he says Libri Duo, so 2 books. So clearly, Esdras was one book in this list, and this is a Christian list. Now there is another list in his work called the Ecclesiastes Offices, and here, as you can see in the critical edition, it says Esdre Duo, so 2 books suddenly. And again, this is a Christian list, because we can see the Deuterocanon there, without any distinction. This is the English translation, if you would like. So the books of the Testaments, and read in the churches of Christ, right? He says 2 books of Esdras, and of course, as I said, he mentions the Deuterocanon as well. In the same work, the Ecclesiastes Offices, there is another list where he says these are the writers of the Old Testament according to the tradition of the Hebrews. So there's another list, and this list represents the Hebrew collection. And he basically says that Esdras wrote his own book, or his book. So that would be one book. And there's another one, another list. Again, he says the third class is of sacred writings, Hagiographa, eighth Ezra, again one book. Naturally, this is again a Jewish list, or a list that tries to reconstruct the Hebrew collection of sacred books. And the last list comes from his etymologies. And again, in this list, he tries to reconstruct the Hebrew collection, but further, he then adds that the church, besides these, recognizes these additional books, and he lists basically the Deuterocanon. What is interesting when he mentions the book of Ezra, he says the book of Ezra is entitled after its own author. In its text are continued the words of Ezra himself and of Nehemiah as well. Let it not disturb anyone that we speak about a single book of Ezra, because the second, third, and fourth are not accepted among the Hebrews, but are counted among the Apocrypha. So the Jews have one single book of Ezra. Now, the question is, what are the second, third, and fourth? I personally don't know, because it's quite a different naming convention he's using, apparently. And when you look at the continuation of this list, when he finishes the list of the Hebrews, he goes on saying that besides these, the church uses also some other books, and he lists the Deuterocanon, but he's not mentioning the second, third, and fourth as well. So I don't know what are these three, but what is actually significant that he here says only one book, and that's the same book that is received by the Christians, so it would be Ezra and Nehemiah. So here's the summary of his lists. So in the first two, he gives us a Christian list, the books that are read in the churches of Christ, as he says. He lists the Deuterocanon in both. But the difference is that in the first list, he mentions only one book of Esdras, while in the second, he gives us two books of Esdras. And the third and fourth and fifth list are reconstructing or representing the Jewish collection. So, again, he knows of a collection or a way of rendering the books of Esdras when there's just one, and also a way when you can say there are two books of Esdras, yet this doesn't mention any inconsistency, any incoherence. Clearly, for Isidore, there is no contradiction between the two. You can just use one way or the other. Now, of course, the question is when he mentions just one, when he mentions just one, clearly it refers to the Vulgate way of rendering. But when he mentions two, the question is he now subdividing this one book into Ezra and Nehemiah as first Esdras and second Esdras? Or is he giving us the enumeration according to the Old Latin? Both options are possible. But still, the fact remains that he's not mentioning that, there's an extra book in one of the collections. So he's not noticing any difference, any inconsistency. So Bogat says, Isidore too used the new translation frequently. Fontaine estimates that in the De Natura Rerum, 2/3 of the citations were borrowed from the Vulgate. His premia to the biblical books may be taken as evidence that he issued a Bible where the translation of Jerome had the main place, but the reconstruction of this Bible cannot be attempted with precision on the basis of such Spanish Bibles as are preserved. So again, this just proves he was familiar with both translations, but he, for him, both are the same. Actually, no discrepancy there. And again, Denter says that for him, for Isidore, there is only one book of Esdras, which narrates the deeds of Ezra and Nehemiah. However, if at one point he mentions two books of Esdras among the Old Testament books, Esdredoi, it is only out of respect for the old lists that he does so. This is a speculation at best, I would say, that he mentions it out of respect. I mean, if he was using the Old Latin as well, even though in De Natura Rerum 2/3 come from the Vulgate, still 1/3 comes from the Old Latin, so it's not just out of respect. For him, for Isidore, the two books would be the same as the one book. So, same book, different translation, different version. That's all it is. There are two more figures, more or less contemporary, with Isidore and in Spain. So Isidore is from Seville, but there are two figures from Toledo, contemporary figures, Eugene from Toledo and Ildefonso from Toledo. Roughly, they were living in the same period. One died in 657, the second one in 667. So they maybe even knew each other. That's quite... there's a high chance that they knew each other. Both give us a list of the sacred books. Eugene mentions one book of Esdras. Ildefonso mentions two books of Esdras. And again, interestingly, this just means that both way of rendering or enumerating of the books of Esdras was possible. Again, I don't know if when Ildefonso mentions two books, is he saying that the one Ezra, which Jerome translated, are actually two, Ezra and Nehemiah, or is he saying that the first one is according to the Old Latin, so it would be the Greek Esdras, and the second one would be Nehemiah? I don't know. The point is, again, that there's no contradiction. No one reports anything unusual. Okay, nothing unusual between the two, between the old and the new. You can enumerate it as one book, and you can enumerate it as two books. No difference. But we have also Pope Gregory the Great, and he says that I use the evidence sometimes of the new translation, sometimes of the old one, since the apostolic see over which by God's grace I preside uses both. So it's very similar with Isidore. He clearly prefers the Vulgate when it comes to his works, but he would be still familiar with the old one as well. So he's using both, and Pope Gregory the Great would not notice any difference. He would not notice that the old one has a special book, an extra book, but the new one doesn't. Doesn't make sense, does it? So here's the summary. Ezra and Nehemiah are distinguished as two books in many manuscripts in the West, as we saw in Emetinus, the Cole manuscript, Cavensis, Toletanus, and so on. The Greek Esdras is very rarely present. Actually, we have only Colbertinus and Saint Germanensis before the 10th century. That's very scarce. I mean, if it was actually elevated to a canonical level in the North African councils, we should see the Greek Esdras all over the place. Why only two manuscripts? Quotations from the Greek Esdras dropped to zero in the West. Again, if it was viewed as canonical and divine scripture. Why so? Church fathers don't report on the difference between the Old Latin and the Vulgate. There's no discrepancy. This just proves that the Greek Esdras was basically Ezra, Nehemiah was Nehemiah, and so first and second Esdras is the same as the one book of Ezra. They didn't care about different translation. Okay, as Augustine said, both the Septuagint and the Hebrew are inspired when it comes to the text. But of course, Augustine never surrendered the Deuterocanonical books. He always affirmed them. So was this the influence of the Vulgate that the Greek Esdras was not quoted anymore, that it's not in the manuscripts? I really don't think so. So clearly these guys knew about the Old Latin. Isidore, Gregory, Ildefonso, Eugene von Toledo, all these guys. Cassiodorus, right? But, they didn't notice anything unusual. So they had both. So it cannot be really the influence of the Vulgate. If Greek Esdras was viewed as a separate, standalone, canonical book, it should have been incorporated into the Vulgate, just as other Deuterocanonical books, which were not included by Jerome, but the Church included it into the Vulgate. Why did the Church omit the Greek Esdras? The only simple explanation is because they already had it in the Vulgate. It was in the form of Ezra and Nehemiah. Another thing why I don't think it's the influence of the Vulgate is because when you look at the Coptic canon does not include the Greek Esdras, while they follow the Septuagint originally. Later, they translated the Bible into Boharic and Sahidic, so their own language. And of course, they did not use the Vulgate. Certainly not. The Coptics didn't. And what is even more interesting, that the Coptics are the only church from the what we would call Oriental Orthodoxy or non-Chalcedonian churches. So these churches were separated in 451 after Chalcedon, the Ecumenical Council. Until 451, they were part of the large one united church. And so how come the Coptics don't have Greek Esdras? I don't get it. So they used formally the Septuagint. They could not be influenced by the Vulgate because they never used the Vulgate. They used the Greek, later on their own language. Isn't it because they're in North Africa? Alexandria is the center of the Coptic Church. And Alexandria is just next to those regions, Hippo and Carthage. Very close, actually. And isn't it rather because the North African councils influenced the Coptic Church? So we saw that the decrees of Hippo and Carthage were eventually accepted and included in the Greek as well. They were translated, they were affirmed into law. Of course, the North African councils happened before Chalcedon, so these councils would have an impact on Alexandria, I would say. And of course, that's the nearest church of the East, right? So these decrees, I think, would make it into Alexandria. But if that was the reason why they don't have the Greek Esdras anymore, that would actually point to the argument that first Esdras and second Esdras, at least by the last council, Carthage 419, first and second Esdras were Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, so they would go with this way of rendering and enumerating of the books of Esdras. Another indication is that when it comes to the Council of Florence, which says Ezra and Nehemiah, and as we saw in those various Vulgate manuscripts, Ezra is always followed by Nehemiah, but not the Greek Esdras. So you have Ezra, Nehemiah, always side by side. So clearly Ezra and Nehemiah here are our Ezra and our Nehemiah, but not the Greek Esdras. Further, if there's a strife for reunion between Florence and the Coptics, clearly they did not mean the Greek Esdras on the Ezra. that wouldn't make any sense, because the Coptic canon has exactly the same canon as we have, the same books. Okay, they have some textual variances. Of course, they would have an additional psalm, and Premanessa would be included in Chronicles, but actually they have the same books. So why would anyone think that the Council of Florence included the Greek Esdras? Doesn't make sense. If they both want to unite, they have both the same canon, right? And in that time, the Ethiopian church would go with the same canon because it was under the Coptic church. It wasn't a separate church until much later. Further, as we saw, the earliest Syriac manuscripts would not include the Greek Esdras, and as I mentioned, the Ethiopic Textus Receptus did not include the Greek Esdras. So clearly, I don't see any influence of the Vulgate here. So my conclusion is that we need to interpret the data coherently. If Greek Esdras was quoted, but at the same time 1st and 2nd Esdras was regarded as one, Ezra and Nehemiah, among the Jews, then the Greek Esdras was simply an alternative version of Ezra, not a standalone book, and therefore the canon is not affected. The canon means that you have a separate standalone book, not a different version. That's textual variance or translation. Canon means, different canon means that you have a different book. Okay, of course, modern scholars would say that the Greek Esdras is a different book, but that's not how the early church viewed this book. So I think Roger Beckwith is spot on here. Actually, Roger Beckwith is the most popular scholar among Protestant apologists. Many apologists would say he is the best scholar, okay, when it comes to the canon of the Old Testament. And this is what Roger Beckwith says on page 100 in his the Old Testament canon of the New Testament Church. The explanation, as in the case of the fathers of the first 4 centuries, whose practice is similar, is probably that first Esdras, which is the Greek Esdras, was regarded as an alternative Greek translation of Ezra and not as a rival book. He repeats this on page 253. The fathers before Jerome seem to have translated first Esdras just as an alternative version of the canonical Ezra. On pages 339 and 340 says, although first Esdras occurs in the Septuagint manuscripts as Esdras A, the simplest explanation of this phenomenon is not that they regarded it as a different book, but that they regarded it as an alternative and fuller Greek version of the same book. Notice this, the question of the canon, therefore, is probably not involved. Yes, that's what I'm saying. The canon is not affected by different versions or different translations. The canon is affected if you have an extra standalone book, but that's not what we see here. So would these Protestant apologists affirm what Beckwith says? I hope so. I hope so. If this is the case, then the decrease of the North African, and then, as I said, there is no difference, And furthermore, the decrees of the North African Council say nothing about a particular version of the canonical books. They only merely list the books. So you find there only a list of books, and it says Esdras 2 books. If you want to argue that they followed a particular version or translation, then that would also mean that they like affirmed a different Job, they affirmed a different Jeremiah, because Job was shorter, this is what Bogat says. The way the book of Job is cited by the Latins is illuminating. It is known that the first translation of Job into Greek was shorter than the accepted text by at least 389 lines. The Septuagintal translation of Jeremiah is shorter than the Masoretic text. But as I said, the fathers used both. They were quoting both. The longer one and the shorter one. So, saying that Greek Esdras particularly was affirmed by the North African Council, this particular version was affirmed, is the same thing as you would be saying that the shorter Jeremiah was affirmed by the North African Councils. Who would make such a hilarious claim? Certainly no scholar would do that. Again, here's Emmanuel Toe's article. He says that the Septuagint is shorter than Masoretic by 1/7. So there's a much greater discrepancy between the Septuagintal version of Jeremiah and the Masoretic text of Jeremiah. Much bigger difference than between the Greek Esdras and the Hebrew Ezra. So this argument that they affirm this particular version would be, I think, a little bit strange. So, the North African councils merely list the books, the Council of Florence merely lists the books, and it's the Council of Trent which, somehow relates the canon also to the text, because when he lists the books, the canonical books, the inspired books, then the decree goes on saying that the aforesaid books, so those books which were listed, in their entirety and with their all parts should be accepted, okay, as they are contained in the Old Latin Vulgate edition. So this means that they should be accepted with all their parts. The reason why the Council of Trent is so specifying this is because Protestants would reject some parts of Daniel and Esther. So it makes sense, right, that the Council of Trent is, emphasizing that all their parts have to be accepted as they are contained in the Latin Vulgate. I heard an argument, that Jerome included the Greek Esdras in his Vulgate in an appendix. Show me the evidence. There's no evidence for that. But here clearly, when the Council of Trent talks about the fact that as they are contained in the Old Latin Vulgate edition, the word they means that those books that are listed. So that would, of course, exclude the Greek Esdras. But is there a possibility that actually the North African councils were pronouncing the canon in relation to a specific translation? Let's say that they did. Okay, let's say they had a specific version in mind. The last council, Carthage 419, I would argue, would actually follow the Vulgate. And here's the reason why. As we saw, that what followed the North African councils was that the quotations rapidly drop. They're really just occasionally in the manuscripts. So that's a consequence to the decision of the North African councils. So in light of what followed after the councils, clearly then at least the last council, Carthage 419, would follow the Vulgate. And notice also this, Gallagher writes in his article in the Textual History of the Bible that Jerome produced Ezra and Nehemiah in 394 or 395. That would be actually the same year as the Vulgate version of Job was translated, circa in 394, so the same period. And what is interesting, that this Vulgate version of Job was already known in year 403, because we have evidence for that. Augustine is mentioning Jerome's translation of Job from the Hebrew, so it's the Vulgate version, and he says that a certain bishop was reading this version, this Jerome's translation, in a congregation. So if in year 403 Job was known already in the Vulgate version, it means Ezra and Nehemiah would be known as well, I would argue. Gallagher says in another article that we have evidence from Augustine that Jerome's version of Samuel and Kings was known in North Africa by 397. Jerome was certainly known to North Africans at that date. Okay, so the reason why this is significant, because I heard this objection that Carthage, the Council of Carthage certainly could not follow the Vulgate, because the Vulgate was not disseminated so early on. So it was not the standard text, in Christendom in the Latin West. That's true. Certainly, still the Old Latin would be the majority text, so that would be mostly used. But is it necessary that everybody is using the Vulgate? I don't think so. I think what is necessary, that at least some people are aware of Jerome's translation, and the most important people, right? So Rome, the Bishop of Rome, Pope, and at least the North African councils. And as we saw, a random bishop was familiar with Job in year 402. So how can you exclude the possibility that Carthage 419, by that year or by that time, the whole Vulgate wasn't known already? Because Jerome would have finished the Vulgate long before 419, right? So you don't really need the Vulgate to be disseminated through the whole Christendom. It was anticipated that the Vulgate would supersede the Old Latin. The Vulgate was needed. There was a need for a new translation, because everybody acknowledged that the old translations are, there are huge variations between those manuscripts. So they certainly needed the new translation. So everybody knew that the Vulgate at one point is going to supersede the Old Latin. So that makes sense that they would go with the Vulgate. And as I said, certainly the Pope would be familiar with it, because there we have letters from Jerome to Pope Innocent and so on. And so who else than the Pope would be familiar with the Vulgate? Jerome was commissioned from Rome to produce the new translation. And who had the last word? Actually, the Pope, right? So when you look at the decrees of the North African councils, it says that this canon should be consulted with the Transmarine Church. And the last council in 419 says that Boniface, right? So Boniface had to be consulted. So this canon would be known to Boniface, and Boniface would be familiar with the Vulgate. And therefore, as Marin says, the canon concluded with an explicit mention of the need to make this canon of scripture known to Boniface of Rome and other bishops, so that it might be confirmed by them. Taken together, this opens up the possibility that sometime between August 397 and the period immediately after May 419, the consultations opened by the North African Church with the Roman See led to a slight modification of the text of the canon that listed the canonical scriptures that were approved at Hippo 393. The Roman See, at least since the pontificate of Innocent I and the churches from the Latin West in general, were all in full agreement regarding the contents of the canon of scripture. Now, Marin says this slight modification is regarding the Solomonic books. So there was a question whether 3 books are Solomonic or 5 books are Solomonic. Nevertheless, everybody knew that both wisdom, Sirach, are also scripture. Some would say that these are not Solomonic books. Like, for example, Augustine says that there are 3 Solomonic books, but the North African Council say they are 5, right? So this is actually also an evidence that Augustine is not the only figure who is, making a decision on the councils, but the council as a whole with all the council fathers. But what is very significant here that Marin acknowledges that there still is a possibility that there could be a slight modification. Of course, not of the canon itself. The canon remained the same, but they could modify it to a different version. When you look at Lange's article, this seems to confirm it. So when you look at his table here, in the Council of Hippo, Lange says there was 1st and 2nd Esdras. In the 3rd Council of Carthage, that's Carthage 397, again 1st and 2nd Esdras. But Pope Innocent would affirm Ezra. So the Pope Innocent, would be already familiar with the Vulgate, and he would follow the Vulgate version. So he would have the last word, right? And actually, Pope Innocent decreed, right, the canonical list in year 405 when he sent this letter to Exuperius, to the Bishop of Toulouse. So, what is the worst case scenario? If these North African Council decreed a specific version of the canon, a specific translation or version, then in the worst case scenario, let's say that in Hippo 393, they would follow the Septuagint. So first Esdras would be the Greek Esdras, and second Esdras would be Nehemiah. But by the year 419, which would be the last council of Carthage that deals with the canon, certainly it would be modified to the Vulgate version. Certainly. Because Vulgate would be finished by them, it would be known to the Pope, North Africans, and as I said, it's not necessary that the Vulgate is all over the place. Only those people who are, making these decisions, they would certainly be familiar with it. And actually, it's Carthage 419 that made the last decision, and its decrees made it to the North African Code, which was adopted by the East. That's what Osterley says, right? That Trullo adopted the decrees of Carthage. And Munier specifically says that it was the Synod of Carthage in 419 and its decrees that were adopted by Trullo, which would be adopted by Second Nicaea. So that would be the Vulgate, right? They would follow the Vulgate by 419. If you want to disagree, show me why this is not possible. Okay, so how can you safely exclude the possibility that by 419 they would not follow the Vulgate? I think that would be the more plausible, much more certain scenario, right? Because as we saw, Jerome's version of Job was already known in 402 by a random bishop in North Africa. So how come the Pope would not be familiar with it, right? So, and of course, in light of the aftermath, what we see, how the quotations drop, the Greek Esdras is not there, it's not incorporated into the Vulgate. I think it's quite obvious that therefore there is no contradiction. So to summarize, the Greek Esdras was viewed as a variant of Ezra, not a standalone book, so the canon is not affected. The naming convention, not just in the great uncials like the Alexandrinus and Vaticanus, but also in the Latin versions, is too variable. We cannot safely make a connection between manuscripts and the decisions of the North African councils. The Vulgate clearly indicates a separation between Ezra and Nehemiah. Before the North African councils, 1st and 2nd Esdras was viewed as the same book as the one Hebrew Ezra. Okay, so again, it's just a variant. The Greek Esdras is just a variant of Ezra. And after the councils, no discrepancies reported between the old and new. Quotations rapidly drop, and the Greek Esdras is present really just scarcely. What is consistent is that Ezra and Nehemiah is there, but not the Greek Esdras. And the North African councils merely list the books. So just from the list, from the primary source, you cannot really tell that, the Greek Esdras was viewed or decreed as canonical, because that should be your primary source. That's what should give you the first-hand information, right? But it says only 2 books. So the burden of proof is really on the side insisting that the 2 books of Esdras could be only the Greek Esdras and Ezra Nehemiah, or Greek Esdras and Nehemiah. You need to prove it. If you can, then you cannot insist on this. Now I want to address 2 arguments which I commonly hear from apologists, Protestant apologists. This is not brought up in scholarship because scholarship acknowledges this is actually irrelevant. This really is irrelevant. And, that's why scholarship doesn't bring this up, but apologists think that this is a good argument. So one argument comes from the New Catholic Encyclopedia. I use the 2nd edition here. So in the 2nd edition you find this in volume 1, but in the 2nd edition you find this in volume 2. And it's this last sentence you see here that is usually abused, I would say. The Council of Trent definitively removed it, which means the 3rd Esdras, the Greek Esdras, removed it from the canon. Okay, so this gives you an impression that before the Council of Trent, it was in the canon. And the Council of Trent definitely removed it. Now, of course, apologists would not cite anything else from the New Catholic Encyclopedia. For instance, those things which I highlighted, which is this. 3rd Esdras could actually be the original Septuagintal version of the canonical books, while the current Greek translation of Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah could represent the work of Theodotion. The case of 3rd Esdras would then be similar to that of Jeremiah. So that's the same thing what I argued, that you have a shorter Jeremiah in the Septuagint, the longer Jeremiah in the Masoretic text. They're not 2 separate books, they're just 2 different translations. Also, the order of the verses is different in the Septuagint. Further, they would not tell you this. The book was certainly compiled before AD 90, for the Jewish historian Josephus quoted from it. Actually, this is going to be in my next presentation, and you will be surprised how much he quoted it. And now notice this. This is what the New Catholic Encyclopedia says. Until the 5th century, Christians very frequently ranked 3rd Esdras with the canonical books. Until the 5th century, but not afterwards. So, how could the Council of Trent remove this book from the canon if it wasn't there or wasn't quoted as canonical after the 5th century. I mean, there was Florence, right? So, but Florence would not view it as canonical if it was viewed as canonical until the 5th century. It's a little bit confusing, I would say. And this particular article in the New Catholic Encyclopedia was written by one guy. His name was Stuhlmüller. And here's his bibliography. These are the sources he used for compiling this article. I went through each of them, and I could not find a single source from this list which says that the Council of Trent removed Esdras from the canon. But when you look at the first citation, which is from R.H. Charles, the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament in English, this is what you find in Charles. Esdras, first Esdras, is one thing in the early manuscripts of the Vulgate, and it was rejected by the Council of Florence. If it was rejected by the Council of Florence, how could the Council of Trent remove it from the canon if it wasn't there in the first place? You know? So is Stuhlmüller contradicting himself? Because he quite clearly uses Charles, right? He claims to be using it, but Charles says just the opposite. That it wasn't there after Florence, so because Florence rejected it, so the Council of Trent could not remove it, actually. And so what I think happened here is that Stuhlmüller made an error or something. My hunch is that he wanted to say that the Council of Trent decided that Esdras will be removed from the Vulgate and relegated to an appendix, because that's what happened after the Council of Trent. So it was afterwards in the Sixto Clementine Vulgate, you could find it in the appendix as a non-canonical, non-inspired book. Because it's true that by the time when the council took place in the 16th century, mostly these books like 3rd Esdras, 4th Esdras, 3rd Maccabees, they were in the Vulgate intermixed, because the Vulgate was kind of an expanded Bible, just as the Greek manuscripts. So in order to transmit these books, lest they perish forever, because actually they were valuable and used in some way, like prayers, prophecies, not as the word of God, certainly, but they were valuable for the church. So I think he clearly made an error, right? So I know that's not what he's saying. I know he's not saying that removed it from the Vulgate, but I think that's what he intended to do. But, if you want to say, I don't care, it's still saying that it removed Esdras from the canon, so therefore it's true. How do you know it's not an error? I mean, look, I can bring up other sources. I can bring up other secondary sources, because quite frankly, the New Catholic Encyclopedia is just a secondary source. And this article is written by one guy. I can bring up the older Catholic Encyclopedia, which says nothing about this. I can bring up the Russian Catholic Encyclopedia, the Hungarian Catholic Lexicon, or the Encyclopedia Catholica. I mean, these are all the same kind of secondary sources. So now, on what principle are you going to decide, that the New Catholic Encyclopedia is right in this instance, but not the others? Because, for example, the Encyclopedia Catholica, written directly in Rome, dedicated to Pope Pius XII, says that the common doctrine from the 5th century onwards, according to which it, meaning the Greek Esdras, is to be considered apocryphal, is certainly the true one. So it's since the 5th century, which means that Cartridge 419 would decide that this book is not the accepted one, all the way up till Florence and Trent, it was regarded as apocryphal. Therefore, the Council of Trent could not remove it from the canon because it wasn't there in the first place, right? So, if you want to prove your point, you have to go to the primary sources, right? Because you cannot go with secondary sources. Secondary sources can contradict them each other, and they can make an error, right? So, for example, one notable scholar on the canon, and I don't want to mention his name because I have huge respect for him, but he made an error. He mentioned in his book that the Synod of Carthage of 397 omitted the Book of Revelation in Canon 39. Actually, I don't know about Canon 39 because the North African Council of Carthage in 397 lists the canonical books on the Canon 47 and not 39, so this would be one error. But the second error is that Revelation was omitted, the Book of Revelation. Because when you look at the critical edition is important because it will, summarize the oldest attestation, the oldest manuscripts, the most reliable witnesses. Then none of these councils omits the Book of Revelation. It's there in Hippo 393, Carthage 397, and Carthage 419, And also, as we saw that Westcott got confused because he used Mansi, another secondary source, and he thought that Carthage 397 mentions the wrong pope, which is actually not the case when you look at the primary sources. So, if you want to insist that the New Catholic Encyclopedia is right, and the Council of Trent removed Esdras from the canon, show me the primary source. Or, you know what? Show me another source, whatever kind of source, another secondary source, I don't care, which says the same thing, that the Council of Trent removed the Book of Esdras from the canon. Show me this particular thing in another source besides the New Catholic Encyclopedia. Because if you cannot show me, then it's really just this single article that is claiming this. And that's very fishy. Because why would you go this one single article and ignoring all the others which are not claiming such thing or are claiming actually the opposite, the majority, right? So this is such a weak argument. Really, it's embarrassing because, this just shows they don't really care about, research. They care about, just abusing whatever fits their narrative to cause confusion and show evidence. Embarrassing, actually embarrassing. The fact is that when you look at the act of the Council of Trent, that everybody knew at the Council of Trent that they are receiving or affirming the same canon as was affirmed in Florence. That's what the acts say. It's really just a couple of decades after Florence. So, should we think that all these guys were dumb in the Council of Trent and they affirmed a different collection than Florence? That's so hilarious, And the second argument is that the Council of Trent passed over in silence some books, which means that probably they left the canon open, and so a later council can make a different decision and include other books. And this idea, which again you find only in apologetics, you won't find this in any scholarly work, I guarantee. You can find this, background for this claim in the so-called Capita Dubitationum in the Act of Trent. So this is what Hubert Yedin says in his History of the Council of Trent. Particular questions with regard to the canon of the Bible created no serious difficulties. What? Catch that. Created no serious difficulties. For example, whether the Apocrypha, usually found in the editions of the Vulgate, namely 3rd and 4th Esdras, and Maccabees should be expressly rejected or passed over in silence. Now, here's the primary source. Okay, this is the Acta. This is the critical edition of the Acta of Trent. And notice this. This is the question, because before issuing the decree, some fathers want some clarification, and these were really just basically not so important things. And this is the question here that was asked in the council: whether using Dunker's edition, I think Dunker is the best scholar when it comes to the canon of the Old Testament in the Council of Trent. So the question is whether the so-called apocryphal books, catch that, the question already formulates that these are apocryphal books, non-inspired books, whether the so-called apocryphal books that are usually included in all the Vulgate codices of the Bible with the sacred books are to be nominatim rejected by this decree or to be silently omitted. It says usually included in the Vulgate codices because in the 16th century, as I said, they would be usually included. But as we saw in the first millennium, in the Vulgates, I showed you like 2 manuscripts. No, so that's not usually. It was usually in the 16th century, actually. And this is what Dunker says. We may be very brief here. This point arose as a result of an observation of some of the fathers about such books as 3rd and 4th Esdras and 3rd Maccabees, but there was no question that they should be regarded as sacred books. The term apocryphal has here undoubtedly the sense, as we Catholics understand the word, applied to the books that non-Catholics call pseudepigraphic. So the question is not raised because we don't know if it's inspired, whether 3rd and 4th Esdras and 3rd Maccabees is inspired. The question is given because it's usually there in the Vulgate. So should we clarify in the decree that these are apocrypha, because that's what the question suggests, it's apocrypha, or we should not, make this statement in the decree. And this was the voting. So the result of the vote indicated that only 3 fathers wanted the books to be rejected expressly in the decree, 8 did not express themselves, and 42 preferred that nothing be said about them. In the later Vulgate editions, so this is the consequence of this voting, in the later Vulgate editions, 3rd and 4th Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh were added, but as outside the sacred books. This just confirms that they clearly viewed these books as outside of the sacred books, apocrypha, not inspired. Actually, in the look at this. This is the voting, okay? So when they passed over in silence, sub silentio, they say actually libri apocryphi sub silentio. So they are apocrypha. They passed over in silence as apocrypha. So, everybody knew these are not viewed as inspired books, okay? They just simply did not want to, expressly or explicitly reject them in the decree, and rightly so, because when you look at previous councils like Florence, the North African councils, no one bothers to say, that this book is not inspired. Why would they so? If you have a canonical list, a list of inspired books, you don't need to, say that this one and this other book and this other book is not inspired. The list can be endless, right? So you can bring up Enoch and Jubilees and whatnot. And actually, this is how the Council of Trent remained consistent with previous councils, which would not mention an endless list of books which are not inspired. Rather, we simply give you the list of inspired books, and everything outside that is not inspired. That's very easy. So what does the Acta tell us? Whether the non-inspired books should be explicitly rejected in the decree, or this rejection should be omitted from the decree. That's all. The question was raised due to the presence of these books in the Vulgate, not due to their nature or origin. The nature of these books was obvious. They were not inspired. The question was raised in a way that it indicates that these are apocrypha. And the answer Libri Apocryphi sub silentio shows this as well. So if the nature of these books was not obvious, if one wants to, argue that they were basically not convinced about their nature, then there should have been an option to vote for their inspiration, actually. But you could either explicitly reject it or reject it but not mentioning it in the decree. That's all you have, all your options. And further, of course, the appendix in the Sexta Clementine Vulgate, the subsequent Vulgate edition, which was promulgated by Pope Clement VIII in 1952, confirms that the Prayer of Manasseh, as well as two books which circulate under the name of Third and Fourth Book of Ezra, are set aside in this place that is outside the series of canonical books, which the Holy Tridentine Synod accepted and determined should be taken up for canonical. So clearly, there is no confusion at all. Again, this is why you don't find this argument in scholarship, just popular apologetics, who again just try to create some kind of confusion, but there isn't really no confusion. It's really an embarrassing argument. And regarding, whether subsequent councils could possibly make a decision that other books would be included in the canon, I think the decrees of the councils cannot be clearer. And actually some apologists, Protestant apologists, would actually agree and confirm that the Council of Trent is giving us a closed canon, because it says that the truth that is written or contained in the written books and the unwritten tradition which received by the apostles from the mouth of Christ or from the apostles themselves, the Holy Ghost dictating, have come down even unto us, transmitted as it were from hand to hand, following the examples of the Orthodox Fathers, received and venerates with an equal affection of piety and reverence all the books, both of the Old and New Testament. And these are preserved in the Catholic Church by continuous succession. So these books, as received in Trent, this collection was given us from the apostles as from hand to hand. Okay? No book dropped. Vatican I confirms the same. Furthermore, this supernatural revelation, as declared by the Holy Synod of Trent, is contained in written books and in unwritten traditions which have been received by the apostles from the mouth of Christ himself or through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, have been handed down by the apostles themselves and thus come to us. So the way the apostles received them, in that similar way we receive them. So it's the same collection. But the Church holds these books as sacred and canonical, not because, having been put together by human industry alone, they were then approved by its authority, nor because they contain revelation without error, but because, having been written by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, they have God as their author, and as such they have been handed down to the Church itself. Okay, as such, as were written down. Vatican II Dei Verbum. In his gracious goodness, God has seen to it that what he had revealed for the salvation of all nations would abide perpetually in its full integrity, and be handed on to all generations. So you cannot claim that during the transmission a book, was dropped from the canonical collection, and later, the Church somehow decided that this book should also be in the canon. That would not mean that they were handed on to all generations. So then Vatican II Dei Verbum is false, right? But that is why I say that Vatican II also clearly affirms a closed canon. So there's this continuous transmission as from hand to hand from the apostles, and this collection as such was received by the Council of Trent. This commission was faithfully fulfilled by the apostles, who, by their oral preaching, by example, and by observance, handed on what they had received from lips of Christ, from living with him, and from what he did, or what they had learned through the prompting of the Holy Spirit. The Catechism of the Catholic Church affirms this. Point 120 in the section The Canon of Scripture says, "It was by the apostolic tradition that the Church discerned which writings are to be included in the list of the sacred books. This complete list is called the Canon of Scripture. It contains 46 books from the Old Testament and 27 for the New. So this is a complete list, a complete collection, right? And if you don't want to believe me, go to an unbiased Eastern Orthodox scholar like Eugene Pentuke, who is foremost scholar in the Old Testament in the Eastern Orthodoxy. He says, if one takes into account the clear-cut definition of biblical canon proposed by Ulrich, that the biblical canon is a closed list of books tied to the notion of institutional authority, then strictly speaking, only the Roman Catholic Church can claim for herself a biblical canon, a closed list of 46 books of the Old Testament, officially endorsed by the Council of Trent. So here you have Pentuke acknowledging actually not only the Roman Catholic Church has a closed list, closed canon, but only the Roman Catholic Church has a closed canon. Very interesting. So, my last slide, I decided to put on my last slide none other than the greatest scholar on the Protestant canon, Old Testament canon, none other than Roger Beckwith. He says on page 16, the Tridentine list, which was anticipated by the decree for the Jacobites of the Council of Florence a century before, and ultimately goes back to the 6th century Pseudo-Gelasian decree, and of course has since been endorsed in the dogmatic decrees of First Vatican Council, dogmatic constitutions on divine revelation of the Second Vatican Council. So actually, Roger Beckwith acknowledges that the same list we find in the Council of Trent is found in Florence, is found in the Pseudo-Gelasian decree, which would be the decree of Gelasius, which is sometimes called also as the list from the Council of Rome. Gelasius would modify it in a way that he would add also a list of which books are apocryphal, but the canonical list is the same. So actually Beckwith would affirm that Trent simply accepted and affirmed the same canon, the same collection of books as Florence and as the Gelasian decree, which would also match Pope Innocent's list and the list from the North African councils. So, if you like this presentation, please subscribe, like, share, leave a comment. That helps the algorithm. Also, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon, and also consider supporting William Albrecht's channel. Very great stuff you can find there. And you can also follow Gary's articles on Substack. And I want to thank again John Betts, also Gary and William for the suggestions. And I know this was a great, very long video, and believe me, I mean, it took a long period to go through all these sources, And the reason why I did so, because, some people, apologists, Protestant apologists, try to disseminate all kinds of things. As I said, they just try to use whatever argument seems to fit, their narrative, but don't really go beyond. And so be careful with all these blocks and, these apologists and whatnot, who would use maybe one source, two sources, but don't really do the research. So this is why I think this channel is unique. We really try to go into the primary sources, dive deep, and reveal everything. We don't want to miss a thing. So, and we're doing it for you. So thank you for your attention, and see you with part 4. Bye bye.